Well, good afternoon, everyone. And for those of you that have been attending these lectures over the last several weeks, we're glad to see so many familiar faces back on a weekend where the weather hasn't been the best yesterday and today, so we're happy to see you here. And for those of you that this may be your first time attending a midwinter lecture, we're happy to see you here as well. And to let you know that these midwinter lectures are being recorded this year, and they are posted on our partners' social media platform and YouTube platform, the Gettysburg Foundation. So you can catch all the lectures from this season so far, maybe those you weren't able to make, or if you're just becoming aware of our midwinter lecture series, you can get caught up on those as well. Speaking of our series this year, we've got 2 more weekends left. Next Saturday, our midwinter lecture is titled A Great Dividing Line, Slavery and Freedom in Washington, D.C. during the Civil War, and that will be given by our park historian, Rachel Nicholas. And next Sunday, we've got a program titled Backs to the Wall, The Battle of Mine Creek. I had to look up where that one was, too. That's going to be given by one of our education technicians here at the park, a young man by the name of Andrew Ryjek. So some great talks scheduled for next weekend. Before we introduce our speaker today, who really does not need an introduction for the Gettysburg crowd here we have before us, but if you have any cell phones today, make sure you get those on silent or vibrate or completely off. I would go with completely off because you are in for a real treat today on this program and a topic that has, although somewhat known visually, completely unknown historical background to it. So our speaker today is John Heiser. John is a native of Raleigh, North Carolina, and he served with the National Park Service from 1976 until 2020. First as a seasonal ranger at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park before coming to Gettysburg National Military Park in 1980. While at Gettysburg, John served in a variety of positions as a seasonal interpreter, assistant to the chief park historian, draftsman, facility management specialist in the Structures Preservation and Maintenance Division, and in 1997, John transferred to the Division of Interpretation and Visitor Services at Gettysburg as a historian, managing the park's research library, answering visitor questions, and providing research support to park staff and licensed battlefield guides. Personally, it's been an honor and a pleasure to have John serve as my supervisor at one point, as a mentor, as a colleague, and I wouldn't be here as a historian of this battle and a park ranger if it wasn't for our staff here in the National Park Service over the years, and not for John Heiser. So, John, thank you very much. Warm welcome to John today, everyone.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Dan. Thanks, John. Hey, thank you so much, Dan. I really do appreciate that. That's very kind of you. For most of you that know me, you know I was here for a long time, and I finally can't get away from the place. You keep inviting me back. But thanks to Dan and Chris Gwynn and the staff here in the National Park Service for inviting me to come back to speak to you this afternoon as part of the Winter Lecture Series. I'm a little upset because they would not let me talk about my dog, so instead I'm going to talk about a photograph that was taken here on the battlefield of Gettysburg entitled Unfit for Service. This is a probably famous, iconic image taken on the battlefield very soon after the battle. And the question always comes up, what is the story behind this photograph? Where was it taken on the battlefield? I think this has been discussed long and hard. And before we get to that point of the location of the photograph, which I found 2 or 3 years ago, I'm going to go a little bit about the background, the historiography of this particular image, as well as some of the other images that were taken on the battlefield. One thing about photography during the American Civil War, we're very fortunate that there are historians like Bill Fresnito, who has done so much work, especially with his early books, Gettysburg: A Journey in Time, Early Photography at Gettysburg, and many other pamphlets he's done. And I also have to give kudos to the Center for Civil War Photography, Gary Edelman, and many others who have done so much to expand our knowledge and feature all these particular images either on Facebook, on websites, or however you get to them, or especially in books. It explains a lot to us about the history of the Civil War, and not just the history, but also the human aspects of the Civil War. And I look at all of these images taken at Gettysburg and not just being photographs of the wreckage, the death, destruction, the aftermath of the battle. And people will focus, well, where was it? Where was it? That's really important. To me, yeah, sure, that's important, but what's the really important story behind those photographs? It's the background. It's the story of what happened at that site that caused carnage, like you see here in this particular one, taken out probably, I believe, on the first day's battlefield. That's a whole other subject. But there is a story behind all of these images, and the real story in all of these is what happened at that site. A little bit about the background, though. This man was a pioneer. Alexander Gardner. Is that name familiar to everybody? Gardner, Brady, many others who took these photographs on the battlefield almost in immediate aftermath. Gardner was an interesting man. Scottish-born, immigrated to the United States, and his first major employment was with Brady and Company, Matthew Brady, where he learned the art of wet plate photography. He got so good at it, excelled at it, that in late 1862 he decided to open his own gallery, one in Washington, D.C., and one in New York City. He started out pretty rough, but he had connections in government, in the War Department, and elsewhere, so he was able to make a lot of photographs of individuals, especially a lot of the dignitaries, Abraham Lincoln, and that's kind of how he made his fame. As he started out, too, he brought along with him, I keep hitting the wrong button, I'm sorry. He brought along with him two excellent photographers. Timothy O'Sullivan is probably the most familiar name of the photographers he had here at Gettysburg. O'Sullivan was, he provides some of the best, most clear images, I think, during the war, the ones that we really remember that were taken here at Gettysburg and on other battlefields and other sites. And he had a long career in the aftermath of the war. The other man was James Gibson, who was also a Scottish-born photographer. Like Gardner, he came to the United States, and for his first employed Matthew Brady and Company, where he learned the trade of photography, how to handle a camera, how to focus it. So both of these men joined Gardner in his employment in 1863 and began to photograph following the Army wherever it went. Can everybody hear me okay? Everybody all right? One of those images that they took here at Gettysburg is this particular one. It's titled Unfit for Service, Peach Orchard. It was first really published in the 1880s as a stereo view, the two double images you see here. It didn't get a lot of coverage, I believe, during the war itself or immediately aftermath. It became more famous and identified at Gettysburg in the late 1870s, 1880s, when stereo view photography and stereo viewing at home became really a popular art. The original publication that you see here is actually kind of faded. It's hard to see a lot of detail in this particular photograph. As Bill Frasnito said in Journey in Time, it's really hard to determine where the photograph was taken, most likely on the Trossel farm, somewhere in the second day's battlefield, but kind of left it at that. There really was nothing there to tell you or anybody particularly where this photograph was taken. The first really, I think, in-depth attempt to identify more about it took place in 2010 on the site, the Gettysburg Daily. It was hosted by Bobby Hoosh as one of the licensed guides. He and several other guides took the image, a very clear part of it, put a lot of record and research to it, and went out in the battlefield and did this great presentation on their site, published in 2010, believing it was taken opposite the Rogers farmhouse. But they also tried to put context to that photograph, the story behind it. This didn't just fall out of thin air and bam, happened there on the battlefield. They identified it, though, as being part of Garden's South Carolina battery that was sent forward to support Pickett's division on July 3rd as the infantry assaulted the center of Cemetery Ridge. And wreckage left behind by that battery there opposite the Peter Rogers house. The problem with that is that I'm not really sure if that was the Rogers house for a number of reasons. And what got my interest started in this again was about 3 years ago when Gary Edelman posted on his Civil War page on Facebook that the site of the location of this image has never been determined and yada, yada, yada. I started to think about that. And I took the image, I took the material from Gettysburg Daily, and I went out in the battlefield, went out in the park. I looked real close at the background, and what you see here in the much more clear image that was first published in Miller's Photographic History in 1911, and I didn't think it was the Rogers house either for a number of reasons, but there had to be other candidates out there. tracing where Gardner went on July 5th when he arrived here on the battlefield, and then on July 6th when actual serious photography took place on the battlefield itself, I was pretty sure that's about when that photograph was taken. If Gardner did, as Frasnito and others have said, left town early in the morning of the 6th, journeyed to the southern part of the field where he took this image, the images at the Trossel farm, as well as those gruesome images at the Rose farm and down in the slaughter pen, Little Round Top area, then it had to be somewhere along that line. The Rogers house was a pretty good candidate. But I looked more at the detail of this, and if you really look close, you see a lot of things in here that maybe you can't see in that very unclear stereo view that is on the Library of Congress website. It's not only the dead carcass of a horse still harnessed to the limber pole, the damaged limber itself, the limber chest is wide open, ammunition scattered all over the ground, but around it are the fresh graves, possibly of the drivers, gunners, artillerymen that manned this particular piece. In the further background is a line of vehicles. What are those vehicles? Tail end of an artillery battery. How do you know that? Because I'm sorry, it's that big thumb of mine. How can you tell that? That's a traveling forge. Every battery, Union battery had one, battery wagon. And up here to the left is a caisson, still hooked to their horses. So obviously this battery has stopped on their way headed south, where the 5th Corps and the 1st Corps were on July 6th, and they're backed up, the traffic's backed up on the Emmitsburg Road or the Millerstown Road, and they're not going anywhere, they're taking a break. But there's other material in the background too. The trees, this area back in here, further back in the very clear image, you can see denuded trees, very small trees. So there's something that doesn't match with the Rogers House site. A little more detail, this is from Gettysburg Daily, of those wagons in the background. This is the artillery forge I spoke about, the ambulance and the wagon bringing up the rear, horses still hooked to the limber and then to the traveling forge, trees in the background, and in front of those is the battery wagon. But there's something that's sticking up here between the two. And this is where Rich and some of the other guides found in this detail that there's something here that's not normal on the horizon. That's right here. That's the roof of a structure, a chimney with another small structure sticking out of the back of it or the side of it or the rear of it. Could that have been the Rogers House? Let's take a look at what the Rogers House was in 1863. This is an early drawing by Charles Reed for Battles and Leaders magazine of the Emmitsburg Road. You see the round tops to the left, and right in front of it are the Trossel Farm buildings. Then to the right, this would be the Daniel Klingel Farm. South, that column of smoke marks the Sherfy Farm. And then to the right, here is the Rogers House. Take a close look at that little drawing. Reed was here in 1863. He came back several times in the late 1870s and early 1880s. At that time, then he composed this drawing. If you look close at his rendition of the Rogers House, there are no trees around it. There is no tall structure behind it. It is basically a very small 1.5-story log structure with a small chimney, nothing really outstanding of it, and it's very close to the road. If that photograph was taken in this area out here, the horizon is too low. There's not enough slope where the photograph was taken. Otherwise, that wrecked carriage would probably be over here way, way, way to the left, maybe out of the image. As far as we know, no Confederate battery got that far north on July 2nd or on July 3rd. And there's a reason I say Confederate battery for a number of reasons. I can get into that a little bit later. But as far as the Peter Rogers House was concerned, I canceled that out right away. I just could not match that on the horizon behind that line of vehicles and where the landscape was and where they said it was. There had to be other candidates along the Emmitsburg Road. So looking closely was at the Daniel Klingel Farm right here. There's a lot more tree growth around it. There were buildings on the east side of the house itself. I eliminated that right away. But there was a better candidate just about 300 yards south, and that would be Joseph Sherfy Farm. But this is the only photograph I'm aware of, there might be one out there somewhere else, of what the original Rogers house looked like in 1863, and that's a small white structure right there. The later house that was built sometime between 1875 and 1880 stands just to the left of it. The original Rogers house was later removed sometime around 1890, or maybe a little bit after. But there's no trees around it. There's no tree growth. There's nothing there. And again, look at the gentle slope between the house and the site where they believed the wreckage was photographed. It just didn't match. A better candidate is the Joseph Sherfy Farm. This 76-acre farm was located right near the intersection of Wheatfield Road, Emmitsburg Road. Everybody probably knows where that is. I'm double talking here. But the house looked just like this in 1863, large trees on either side of it. The Sherfy family is really interesting. Joseph was the son of Jacob Sherfy, the first developer and owner of what we know as the George Rose Farm today. He's the one who established that farm, built it. Joseph was a son, bought this property, about 76 acres just to the north of it, where he got more in, not just into farming, but also into the fruit industry. He's the one who owned the peach orchard, had an apple orchard, and had very luscious cherry trees. This was his cash crop. He and his wife lived there together. This is an outlay of the farm you see here on the left-hand side. He owned quite a piece of property around here, the Wentz property right here stuck in the middle, but all of this he owned. The peach orchard itself is located right here. This is the famous, iconic peach orchard, but the orchard extended further north along the Emmitsburg Road, a young orchard, as Sherfy later claimed in his claims files, just to the north of very young trees. And by young trees, we're talking anywhere between 4 to 8 years old. So they're not much older than 8 years. They're pretty small at that time, but they're starting to produce. The Klingel Farm then next to that, as well as the Rogers Farm further up. But looking close at the Sherfy Farm itself, this is the house, and behind it was the 2-story cannery building, also a summer kitchen, the barn here, as well as other farm structures, a hog pen, corn crib, and other things, as well as the prevalent privy just out back. Every farm had one. This is a good look at the Sherfy house around 1880 and as it looks today. The house has changed quite a bit, and if you look real close, you can see those changes. To the left, the original house is pretty much the way it looked in 1863. The cannery and summer kitchen I talked about is just out back, and this is where they took all the peaches, cherries, apples, everything else, canned them, preserved them, some for themselves, but also sold them to the grocers and merchants in town. That was a thriving business for Sherfy. Now to the right, the house as it looks today is a little bit different. When Mrs. Sherfy finally died about 1905, the property was transferred to a new owner, and they made a number of improvements to the house at that time, including a change to the roof line, addition on the back wing of the house. The second story was added. The roof line itself, the larger soffit, and the chimneys were also taken down and rebuilt. Many, many years ago, this is back in the 80s when I was working in maintenance, we had to go up on the roof to measure some of the brickwork up there. And the chimney itself is probably about 6 to 8 inches lower than the original chimney. But I can tell you, it's quite a view up there, but it's also pretty hairy, and you're standing on wood shingles with tennis shoes on. But I survived. So let's take a look back at Unfit for Service again and this particular photograph. That structure I talked about, just to the right of the battery wagon and in front of those horses, if that is the roof line of the Sherfy house with a rather tall chimney, it should be right there off the Emmitsburg Road. Now remember that the barn burned during the battle, so the barn is not there. Sherfy would later rebuild the barn long after the war. It would burn again and then get rebuilt about a year later, and that's the barn that's out there today, but it's on the original site. So taking the photographs out there, this was taken on July 6, 1863, in the morning. I tried to approximate about the same time that photograph was taken, and that is the view of the farm and the site of Unfit for Service, just about 400, 500 yards east of the Joseph Sherfy farmhouse. Reproduction, the new barn is to the left, trees to the right, Emmitsburg Road's just beyond that. The fence line that you see here was there in 1863, and actually it's a reproduction fence, but there was an original fence line there, and those vehicles are parked right along that torn down fence line because of the action fighting that took place that afternoon. So finding the site is one thing. Determining whether the guides were right about that being Garden's battery was another thing altogether. Like I said, the photographs can tell you a lot in detail, picture, once you find the site. But the story is who belonged, who owned, who ran that battery that left behind all that wreckage? Was it Union or was it Confederate? There are more questions that are brought up that can easily be answered. And in comparing the original view, this is a very rough done overlay, the original view with my modern view, you see the perspective here of where I believe that photograph was taken, and I think I'm pretty right. But there's more to this background. Was it Union or Confederate? I'm pretty sure it was Confederate. There's a number of reasons for that, in that the evening of July 2nd, and even sometime overnight July 3rd, morning July 3rd, again on July 4th, Union artillerymen went out in that field that belonged to the 3rd Corps Artillery Brigade, 5th Corps Artillery Brigade, even some of the volunteer brigades. They brought off all of the equipment they could find. That included ordnance. If there were shells dropped on the field, they picked the stuff up. That's all thanks to Henry Hunt and his extreme discipline he instilled in the Army of the Potomac in the winter of 1863. Nothing was left behind. They had to account for everything, even if it was a thumb stall or a spike. No matter what it was, they had to account for everything, so they were very careful what they gleaned. Why is this still laying out there 3 days later, if it's federal? Why is it still laying there? Especially with the harness on the horse and the saddle on the horse. Why is that still laying there? That's what I really believe is Confederate. And if we look back at the record of the Confederate artillery line on July 3rd, 1863, the line was laid out from the peach orchard north through the Sherfy farm, Klingel farm, Spangler farm, Rogers farm, all the way to Spangler Woods. A very long line, almost 150 artillery pieces in that artillery line that would precede the charge we know as Pickett's charge today. All that artillery is aimed towards one location, except for this small battery down the peach orchard. There are 2 batteries there from Matthias Henry's battalion of Hood's division. And their job is not really to shell the Union center, but to try and take care of the Union battery on Little Round Top and the fields north of Little Round Top on Cemetery Ridge. Their target is very, very different. Those 2 batteries from Henry's battalion were brought up by this man, John Chief Haskell, who's kind of a tragic figure. He's born in a Tidewater family in 1841. He's attending South Carolina College, which is today University of South Carolina, in 1860 when the war broke out. He's a brilliant, bright young man. He really wanted to go to war right away, but his father said, no, you have 2 sons. I have 2 sons in service now. The last thing I'm going to do is let my youngest son go into service. But in 1861, he allowed him to do so. Haskell went in and through connections, went up on the staff of PGT Beauregard. From there, he went into the staff of Joseph Johnson and was severely wounded in 1862. The battles outside of Richmond during the 7 days. It was so severe, his right arm had to be amputated. After several months of recuperation in Richmond and back home in South Carolina, he begged to go back to the field. And so he was initially assigned to North Carolina, not very happy there on the D.H. Hill. He requested again to be transferred to the Army of Northern Virginia. And he finally had his chance in the spring of 1863. Right after Chancellorsville, John Bell Hood was scheduled to be transferred to the armies in the West, in Tennessee and Georgia. But there was a delay. And Hood, his favorite artilleryman was Matthias Henry, a West Pointer, in charge of one of the artillery brigade for his division. Henry was also slated to go west. They thought, Henry, Hood, they're gone. But things were delayed, as the government does. Things were delayed. And so Haskell comes to the army to be assigned to Henry's battalion. Henry is still there. The two of them then split duties with that battalion during the entire campaign. And it was really kind of maybe an awkward relationship, what could have been an awkward relationship, but Haskell and Henry got along very, very well. And then on July 3rd, when they're preparing this artillery line to shell the Union Center for what we know as Pickett's charge, the orders came from Longstreet to Henry to bring up 2 batteries to station them in this artillery line, and the job was given to Haskell. Haskell led these 2 batteries forward, placed them in the peach orchard, and one of them belonged to this man, Hugh Garden, this very handsome South Carolinian. His story is also connected to a lot of things with like going to South Carolina College, graduated in 1860, went into service right away, served in the 2nd South Carolina in Company D, wound up as a corporal, part of the color guard, and in 1862, through connections with his family and connections with the South Carolina legislature, was transferred back to South Carolina to raise an artillery battery. He was very successful and had, within about 6 weeks, had raised almost 150 men for what they called the Palmetto Light Artillery, armed with 2 6-pounder guns and 2 12-pounder Napoleons. The guns, at least the Napoleons we know, were made of church bells. They'd been donated for that purpose, melted down, and served with the battery. By 1863, the Gardens battery had been through a lot of action. Second Manassas, Antietam, Suffolk campaign, many major battles, Fredericksburg as well. And they had been supplemented now with the 3rd section of 10-pound Parrotts. So that battery was pretty well armed with a variety of guns. Well, I'm not really sure about this, but I believe Garden left the 6-pounders in Virginia, didn't bring that section with him, so he only had a section of 2 Parrotts and a section of 2 Napoleons. As positioned in the peach orchard, facing position to the east, there's not a lot of space in that orchard. Everyone's been out there, I'm sure, and walked it to put up 4 guns, 5 guns, 6 guns, just not enough room. And to reach his objective, and shell his objective on Little Round Top, which would be Rittenhouse's battery, up there in the summit, a distance of maybe about, I'd say a little over a mile, Napoleons are not going to be quite as effective as the Parrotts are going to be. My suspicion is the Napoleons were in reserve, that one section. The Parrotts were put on line, and the Parrotts did most of the fighting and shooting during the cannonade. At the end of the cannonade, the infantry goes forward. Pickett passes by and through all that artillery. And at that time, everyone who's read about the battle knows that the Confederate ammunition is running very, very low. They're only able to send a few batteries forward. As Haskell says in his memoir, I was ordered to move with all the guns I could take from the line, I think about 5 on Pickett's right flank. I moved about halfway to the heights, having no special orders beyond that. I was to help where I could. The 5 guns he's referring to, and some of the Union counter view points out that it was maybe about a Confederate battery that went forward. Some of the guns probably came from Eshelman's battalion, the Washington Artillery in New Orleans, maybe about 3 or 4 of those guns. The others did not have adequate ammunition to do so. How far did they advance? According to Eshelman, some of them went out maybe 200 yards, some 300 yards, maybe a quarter of a mile. They did not go that far north to where the Peter Rogers farm would be, but instead they went out into this plain, this field, the slope down from the Emmitsburg Road down towards Plum Run Valley. And one of those sections that went out belonged to Garden's South Carolina battery. As Hugh Garden later said, one section of my battery under Lieutenant William McQueen made the advance when it moved obliquely to the left and went into position at a point down a gentle descent, as I can never forget, about 200 yards to the left of the peach orchard, and about 300 yards at least in front of our line of artillery. Where would that place him? That would place the battery, the section under Lieutenant McQueen, right about here, where the photograph was taken by Gardner and his team on July 6, 1863. This is the view from that location that I showed earlier, it's absolutely perfect on this gentle slope looking north towards Cemetery Hill and where the infantry had then crashed into the Union center at the angle. At this point, they can fire artillery into Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and the Union troops behind it. The difficulty is trying to find a target in all that dust and smoke that's now being kicked up because of the infantry fight that's in full pitch. Maybe their concentration, though, should be to the photograph you see at the right and Union batteries on Cemetery Ridge, a distance of maybe about 3/4 of a mile. And those Napoleons were very effective at that range. They could hit any of the Union batteries up there. The problem was they were outgunned about 30-1. And this is what it comes down to. J. Merrick Reed was one of those gunners, Lieutenant McQueen's section, that went out there that day. And he started to write and collect history about the battery and what it did at Gettysburg around the turn of the century. As he wrote, you can read it here. I'll read it for you for those who can't quite see it. The devoted third section of the battery promptly limbered up. Each man assumed place, and we moved quickly and obliquely across the descent through orchard and waving wheat. On and on under the black yawning mouths of 24 guns to the heights above, silent but gaping and yawning at the amazing audacity and awaiting developments. They came quickly. Action front, load, fire. Then all hell broke loose. No sooner had flame and smoke gushed after the hurling shell than Round Top Hill became a veritable volcano of destruction, hurling metal missiles that hissed or shrieked or wailed through space. The ground was plowed and torn. Man after man went down with his death hurt or disabling wound, and not a horse was left to move a wheel. This illustration to the right was drawn by Alfred Waugh very soon after the battle, based on descriptions from Union artillerymen that countered this section and those guns that went out there in the field. And the evidence, to me, from the official records and other accounts I found, is those gunners that went out with the guns from the Washington artillery did not stay very long. There's several accounts of the men basically abandoning the guns, racing back to the safety of the main Confederate artillery line, or limbering up and getting out there as fast as they can go, leaving behind whose section? Lieutenant McQueen's section at that location out there in the pasture, wheat field, opposite the Sherfy farm. The Union response was quick and deadly. Captain Patrick Hard, the 15th New York Battery, is one of the accounts I really focused on, because after he brought a section to bear on me, I brought all of the guns of my battery to bear on this section. The first gun I fired exploded one of the limbers. Corporal Hammond, with the next shot, dismounted one of these guns. Sergeant William Shee followed with equal success. There was not a gun fired or a man to be seen afterward until late evening. They sent down horses and took away one limber. Just about 100 yards south of there was Dow's 6th Maine Battery, armed with James rifles, 4 James rifles. Very accurate gun, probably one of the finest guns made during the war, but there just weren't a lot of them. But Dow's battery also concentrated on that section right in front of them, a distance of not more than 3/4 of a mile. As Dow reported, this fire lasted without much abatement till about 1.5 hours, when we discovered the enemy advancing under cover of their artillery. A light 12-pounder battery of 4 guns ran some 400, 500 yards in front of the enemy's line so as to enfilade the batteries on our right. We opened with solid shot and shell upon this battery and succeeded in dismounting one gun, disabling the second, and compelled the battery to leave the field minus 1 caisson and several horses. Just right next to them, Captain Phillips with the 5th Maine Battery reported basically the same thing. The rebels had advanced a battery of 12-pounders on our left, whereupon the batteries of the 1st Brigade were ordered to concentrate their fire upon it, which was done with such good effect that the rebel cannoneers were driven from their posts almost immediately and left their guns in the field. Up in the peach orchard, Hugh Garden is watching with not only a concern but alarm as to what's happening to his comrades down there in the field. Lieutenant McQueen, who was also a member of the South, had also gone to South Carolina College with Garden and had served in the 2nd South Carolina Infantry and was an excellent lieutenant, was severely wounded, and Garden saw him stumbling back through the peach orchard back to the safety of the Emmitsburg Road, when he rode forward, dismounted, and saw the section just being obliterated before his very eyes. He wrote, "The attention of the opposing artillery was drawn to our fire, and within 10 minutes every horse and man was killed or wounded. I took volunteers and fresh horses in to remove my men and gun. After 2 attempts, we succeeded on the same concentrated, terrific fire made from terrible by the explosion of caissons and the fire overhead of our friends in the rear." So not only are they facing Union fire, but also the guns behind them are firing over their heads as he's trying now to remove his wounded and retrieve what he can from his battery out there in the field. There, for the first and only time during the entire war, I felt compelled to encourage my men by personal example. Garden was one heck of an officer, brave man, and personally went back at least half a dozen times just to retrieve wounded men before he actually was able to retrieve the guns from the field. But as he says later, and unfortunately, there is no official report from he or Henry, or Hazlitt for that matter, in the official records to really know what happened out there, apart from these accounts I was kind of scrabbled together from the OR. But later on, Garden could never, ever even write about this event until long, long after the war. The section was destroyed. What's curious about all of this, as I'm going through maps and looking at the accounts and putting them all together and trying to not just justify the site, but tell the story of the photograph at that site, I looked at some of the maps, and one of the curious things is Elliott's map of the battlefield that's published in 1864. In this particular area where the photograph was taken, there are details that show graves, the carcasses of horses, and some other debris scattered around. And that little area there is curiously similar to what you see in that photograph, Unfit for Service, peach orchard. To me, it makes a lot of sense when the camera direction is then to the west, with the Sherfy house behind it, barn's no longer there, and the fence lines are all gone. Now, granted, the Elliott map is notoriously inaccurate in a lot of areas. In other areas, there is some element of accuracy to it. Is one of these maps was published very, very early in 1864, generally to show the battlefield and try to show the amount of graves, burials, and even horse carcasses scattered all over the field. But there are some details about it that are intriguing that you can't just deny, well, let's just throw it out. There's too much there. But that map, as well as the battlefield maps, the Gouverneur K. Warren survey map of 1868-69, and the War Department Commission map, 1892 and 1893, and again in 1895, show basically the same area that we're looking at today on this map and many of the others as to the type of crop patterns that were there, especially the fence patterns, and where the peach orchard was. If we follow Garden's description, as he said, 2 yards north of the peach orchard, about 300 yards in front of the Confederate artillery line, that's the location. So there's more to the story naturally as we go through these things. Putting this all together, I'm pretty sure that that's the site of where this photograph was taken. And again, as I say, every picture tells a story, and the story here is the destruction of the one section under Lieutenant McQueen of Garden's battery. As far as some of the personalities are concerned, Matthias Henry commanded the artillery brigade or battalion of Hood's division. His report never wound up in the OR. It never survived. He did not have a time, evidently, in the aftermath of the war to write about it. He was struck with paralysis, I believe it may have been polio, and died in 1877 without leaving behind any record of the battalion's surface at Gettysburg. As far as some of the others are concerned, John Chiefs Haskell, he wrote his memoir in 1906, in which he discusses what happened on July 3rd, 1863, and commanding the section to go out there. But that was really for his family, and it was never published until 1960. So we really didn't know from anybody, from Haskell especially, what happened that afternoon. He did lament to a veteran, several veterans years later, about, you really need to write what happened to you during the war. And he just said, no, I don't want to open old wounds. I think that was kind of common for a lot of Southern officers, former officers who had lost so much, especially comrades and friends out in the battlefield. And one of the other ones who was very, very particular about that, I think, was this man, Hugh Garden. What happened in his service during the war, the loss of so many close friends, the destruction of his battery by the end of the war. In the aftermath, he decided he was not going to open those old wounds again, not going to cash in on the popularity of it, but he went to work, became a lawyer. He opened an office in South Carolina. Later in Richmond, Virginia, before he opened came into a partnership in New York City in 1883 and was there for several years working in legal services. What inspired him, though, to write about it really has very little to do with the battle. It's the aftermath. When the park was established in 1895, the Park Commission was responsible for then putting out markers and monuments out on the battlefield to mark every infantry, brigade, division, corps, and battery position. William Mack Robbins was the, I'd say, Southern Commissioner, if you want to put it that way, veteran of the 4th Alabama. He was responsible for then composing the tablets that went out to mark all the Confederate battery positions you see on West Confederate Avenue, north part of town, as well as East Confederate Avenue. The problem Robbins faced right away was trying to find records in the War Department records, what we know as the official records, to say what every unit did. The difficulty with Garden's battery, and for that matter, Henry's entire battalion, was trying to find a concise record in the official records that had been saved in the war, what those batteries did. So when he composed the tablets that are out there today, he basically relied on the report of one battery out of the battalion. And to be honest, they're incorrect because they don't go into the record of what Garden Battery and Riley's North Carolina Battery from that battalion did on July 3rd by going to the Peach Orchard, and especially with Garden, being involved in this little action at the very end of Pickett's charge. That kind of caused a flurry, especially with a handful of veterans of Garden's old battery. J. Merrick Reed, who I spoke about, began to gather history and started writing letters to his former commander and several others he knew, putting together a history exactly what happened to them. And he published some of his memoir in an Anderson, South Carolina newspaper about his experiences at Gettysburg, part of which I just read you. Lloyd Collis, who was the son of Charles Collis, former colonel of the 114th Pennsylvania, was also very interested in what happened there on July 2nd. Even though his father was not there, his father's regiment was literally destroyed out there on the Joseph Sherfy farm in the heavy fighting on July 2nd. And Collis got wind that Hugh Garden was still alive, was a lawyer, practicing law in New York City, wrote him a letter and asked what happened to your battery there in Gettysburg. Garden wrote him a very detailed letter, part of which I've featured here today in this program, describing exactly what happened. And to give the guides leniency, they did not have that account that I found or a friend of mine found several years ago, where Garden specifically states 200 yards north of the Peach Orchard, 200 yards in front of the main line, that places it out there in that site. But Garden, you could tell, even in that aftermath, even in that period, in 1906, that it still felt it personally. Some of my best men fell there. I've always thought that as Pickett's charge marked the high tide of the Confederacy, the advance of that solitary section in obedience to what I understood to be General Longstreet's order to advance the artillery marked the highest and the greatest artillery duel in history. The tablets were never corrected. Robbins wrote Reed and several others that he would try to make those corrections, but unfortunately he passed away in 1906 before any corrections could be made. Reed died a few years later. Haskell died about 1910, I believe, and then Garden died about a year or so later. So the record was lost with those men, and the record stands out today as basically being incomplete. But as I said again, and I'll say it again and again and again, the photographs themselves tell the story. We just have to keep digging for it. We just have to keep looking for it, and you find the story. And I believe I've uncovered the story of Unfit for Service. If anybody has any questions or comments, glad to try and answer them for you. Otherwise, thanks for coming out this afternoon. Stay dry out there and enjoy your day.